Hello, my name is Jim Leahy, and I'm delighted to have been asked by the Concord Library to participate in the Concord Reads Aloud program. I have lived in Concord since 1975, since which time I've worked for 25 years as the manager of Concord Spice and Grain from 1975 to 2000, and then in the last 20 years I've been the manager of Deborah's Natural Gourmet. So I've almost had one job in two different locations for the entire 45 years, although it changed greatly in those years, as one can imagine. Deborah was kind enough to put my name forward as a reader for this project, so I am going to go ahead and read the 17th chapter, chapter 17 of the Penderwicks. So here goes. It's called The Next to Last Day. Batty woke up before Rosalind's alarm clock went off. There's no need for an alarm when a dog is licking your face. Go away, she whispered to Hound. He pranced across the room and whined at the closet door. That wouldn't do. He would wake up Rosalind, who was still dreaming next to Ursula the bear. Batty slid out from bed, grabbed Hound by the collar and tugged. Hound sat down and refused to budge. She tugged harder, all in vain. Disgusted, Batty let go of Hound, padded over to the bedroom door and opened it. Almost before she could leave the room, Hound had bounded past her and down the hall to plant himself in front of her bedroom door. You want to see Geoffrey, don't you? She said. Hound looked mournfully at her. Well, I'd like to see him too, but we can't because he's still asleep, so there. Hound answered with one short, defiant yip, but when Batty started down the steps to the kitchen, he followed her. Cereal was the only kind of breakfast Batty was allowed to fix by herself, and since the day she had spilled a gallon of milk on Hound's head, it had to be cereal without milk. She pulled a chair over to the counter, climbed on it, got down the Cheerios box and climbed off the chair. Just as she did every morning, she poured Cheerios onto the floor for Hound to lick up, then let him out the back door for what Mr. Penderwick called his morning rituals. Now it was time for her own meal. She took the Peter Pan bowl off the low shelf where it was kept for her and paused with the Cheerios box in mid-air. Outside, Hound was barking as though under attack by aliens from outer space. Batty looked out the screen door. It wasn't aliens, though they would have seemed scarcely this dreadful to Batty. It was Mrs. Tifton and Dexter, and Hound was doing his best to keep them away from the cottage. Batty backed away from the door, but she was too late. Mrs. Tifton had seen her. "Bitty, let us in," she heard Mrs. Tifton yell. "Good dog." That was Dexter, and Batty could tell he didn't mean it. Mrs. Tifton was shouting again. "Dexter, get that dog out of my way." To Batty's horror, the next thing she heard was a smack and a loud dog yelp. She threw open the screen door and cried out to Hound. He rushed in, and Batty threw her arms around his neck and whispered soothing words of love in his ear. Now Mrs. Tifton and Dexter were right at the door, peering in at Batty. Mrs. Tifton wasn't her usual tidy self. Her hair was sticking up in strange places, and she was wearing bedroom slippers and an old raincoat over her nightgown. "Bitty, we're looking for Geoffrey. May we come in?" she said. Batty's answer was to lock the screen door. "By God, she's locked us out, Dexter," said Mrs. Tifton. "Where's your father, you naughty child?" "Remember, Brenda, she doesn't talk," said Dexter. "I heard her call her dog. She can talk if she wants to. Tell us if Geoffrey's here. I want my son." Batty wanted to run away from these awful people, but then who would stop them from coming into the house and hitting Hound again and finding Geoffrey and dragging him away? She had to be strong. Skye had said she was perfect. Well, then she would be perfect and protect the dog and the people she loved. Batty drew herself up and faced the enemy boldly. "It's not that I can't talk, it's that I don't like you, and Daddy says we're allowed to choose the people we talk to." "Your daddy can go to," spat Mrs. Tifton. "Brenda, please," said Dexter. "Let me handle this." "Handle what?" said a voice behind Batty. "Good morning, Batty." "Oh, Daddy." Batty threw her arms around his knees. "They hit Hound." "The child's exaggerating," said Dexter. "I gave the dog a gentle tap to stop his barking." "Pardon me, this hasn't been the best introduction. I'm Dexter Dupree, and you're Martin Penderwick?" "Glad to meet you." "And good morning, Mrs. Tifton," said Mr. Penderwick, stroking Batty's curls. "What can I do for you?" "It's Geoffrey. He's gone. I woke up early because I was worried. You see, we'd gone on a trip and had a terrible argument." "Not terrible," said Dexter. "And I went to see if he was feeling better, and he wasn't in his room. There was only a golf bag in his bed and this note." She pressed a scrap of paper against the screen. "I'll never go to Pensy. Don't bother to look for me," read Mr. Penderwick. "I don't understand the boy. Pensy is an excellent school," said Dexter. "Shut up, Dexter," said Mrs. Tifton. "That's dreadful news," said Mr. Penderwick, "but why have you come to us?" "Geoffrey hasn't been here since the day before yesterday." "Oh, my God," said Mrs. Tifton, swaying a little. "I was hoping I'd find him here. Your daughters, though, they'll know where he's gone. Please ask your daughters." "Batty, do you know where Geoffrey is?" asked Mr. Penderwick, looking down at her. She said not a word, but looked up at him pleadingly with all her heart in her face. After a long moment, Mr. Penderwick unlocked the screen door. "I think you two had better come inside and sit down for a few minutes. I'll go upstairs and speak with the older three." "I'll come with you," said Mrs. Tifton, bursting into the house and heading for the stairs. "It's best for you to wait down here," said Mr. Penderwick. She said. "Sit, please," said Mr. Penderwick, firmly but kindly. Mrs. Tifton collapsed into a kitchen chair and buried her face in her hands. Dexter, whose shoes Hound was suspiciously sniffling, sat down next to her and lifted his feet in the air. "Come, Hound. You too, Batty," said Mr. Penderwick, and the three of them climbed the stairs. Mr. Penderwick knocked on Rosalind's door. The door opened a crack and Rosalind peeked out. "Good morning, Daddy." "Whoops," she said, and dove away from the door to turn off the alarm clock, which had just started beeping. As soon as she let go of the door, Hound pushed through, ran over to her closet and barked. Rosalind grabbed him and dragged him back into the hall. As soon as she let go, he sidled down to Batty's door and barked again. "What's wrong with Hound?" said Mr. Penderwick. "Nothing," said Batty. By now, the noise had woken Skye and Jane, and they had joined the crowd in the hall. "What's happening?" said Jane, still half asleep. Skye kicked her. "Hound, be quiet," said Mr. Penderwick. Hound flopped down and started licking Batty's door. "Now, girls." "Yes, Daddy," answered all four, each looking impossibly innocent. "Mrs. Tifton and Mr. Dupree are downstairs. They seem to have lost Geoffrey. I'm trusting that Jane hasn't carried him off in a hot air balloon." "Oh, Daddy, of course not," said Jane. "That's a good start. Now, to proceed a little further, can any of you tell me where he is?" No one answered. "Rosalind?" "No, Daddy, we may not," said Rosalind. Oh, if only she'd let Geoffrey sleep under Harry's tomato stand. He'd be long gone by now. "May you tell me if he's safe?" he asked, scanning their faces carefully. "Yes, he's safe," said Rosalind. "And comfortable?" "Yes." "Is he in Batty's room?" There was a terrible silence, and everyone hung their heads. "Oh, daughters," said Mr. Penderwick. If you knew everything you'd understand, said Skye. Please don't tell Mrs. Tifton he's here, said Jane. I have to tell her something. The poor woman is worried sick. He thought for a minute. All right. I'll tell her that I know so far. I'll tell her that all I know so far is that he's safe, and that I'll call her after I've tortured the whole truth out of my children. In the meantime, if any of you four happen to see Geoffrey, he stepped closer to Batty's door and raised his voice, tell him not to worry too much. He's not alone in this. The door opened slowly, and out stepped Geoffrey, very rumpled and with dark circles under his eyes. Good morning, Mr. Penderwick. I'm sorry to have caused so much trouble. No trouble at all, said Mr. Penderwick. Would you like me to tell your mother you're here? Thank you, but I should go down and tell her myself. Geoffrey, no, said Skye. Let Daddy do it. It's over, Skye. I might as well go down there and face up to it, said Geoffrey. Besides, Rosalind said I should try one more time to get Mother to listen to me about Pensy, and I guess this is my chance. But what if I was wrong? Rosalind clutched her father's arm. She couldn't bear sending Geoffrey downstairs again to suffer. You weren't wrong, said Mr. Penderwick. Geoffrey, would you like me to go with you? Yes, sir. Geoffrey squared his shoulders. Please. We all will, said Rosalind. Maybe just Jane. It's killed Skye to say this. She's the only one that Mrs. Tifton doesn't completely despise. But Geoffrey, the rest of us will be right here if you need anyone to beat anyone else up. Just kidding, Daddy. Ha, he said, not without humour, then stepped back so that Geoffrey could lead. It was a solemn parade downstairs, with Jane at the rear behind Geoffrey and her father. She was proud to be part of Geoffrey's honour guard, but she had hoped never to see that Dexter again, and there he was, lolling sleepily at the kitchen table. What did he care if Geoffrey's whole future was at stake? Creep. And now Mrs. Tifton was out of her chair, rushing across the room. Geoffrey, oh, my baby. She hugged him close for a long time, murmuring little words of mother love. Jane's eyes welled with tears, and it was hard work to remember how she disliked Mrs. Tifton. But then the sweet murmuring stopped, and Mrs. Tifton's sharp voice came back. How could you do this to me? I'm sorry, Mother, I didn't mean to upset you. Not upset me? What were you thinking? She held him at arm's length. That I wouldn't be upset if my only son ran away? Geoffrey wriggled free. Well, you're safe, and I suppose that's what's important, though of course there has to be some kind of punishment. But let's go home now and forget about it until we're all thinking more clearly. It was obvious that Mrs. Tifton thought she was being generous. No, said Geoffrey. No, she said, her hands on her hips. What do you mean? No. I want to talk now before we go home. Don't push your luck, young man. I've been amazingly patient so far, considering what you've put me through. Geoffrey looked over at Mr. Penderwick, who nodded encouragingly. He took a deep breath and tried again. Mother, I have something very important to tell you. I've tried to tell you before, but you've never listened. Please listen this time. Please. This is ridiculous. When don't I listen to you, Geoffrey? Just sit down and let me talk, please. Brenda, honey, Dexter was no longer looking so sleepy. Perhaps he was worried about his own future. You don't have to do this in front of these people. Jane bristled. These people, indeed. Someday when she was famous, and on television talk shows, she would tell the story of Dexter Dupree, Mr. Lines on the road, and humiliate him in front of the world. Just 1 minute, and then I'll go home, I promise, said Geoffrey. Mrs. Tifton looked from Dexter to Geoffrey, then sat down in her chair. "It's all right, Dexter. There's nothing Geoffrey can say that could embarrass me. If he has something so important to discuss, I'll listen for a minute. 1 minute, young man, that's all you have." "I don't want to go to Pensy. Not next month, not next year, not ever." Mrs. Tifton stood up. "We're not going over that again." "Mother, you said you'd listen." She sat down again. "I loved Grandpa, you know I did, and I still miss him, but I'm not him, and I'm not like him." "Yes, you are, dear. This is silly. We've known you ever since you were a baby." "You've known, and Grandpa knew, but you never asked me what I thought." "Why, you used to march around wearing that little military cap that Papa gave you for Christmas and call yourself General Geoffrey, and you looked so happy." "I don't remember any of that." "You were very young then, 2 or 3, I suppose." She stopped, confused. Geoffrey moved closer to his mother. "Do you remember telling me about when Grandpa tried to teach you how to swim?" "Of course I do." Mrs. Tifton shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "You were 5 years old and you were terrified of the water, but he insisted you learn, and you begged and begged until Grandpa just picked you up and threw you into the deep." Mrs. Tifton made a little sound at the back of her throat, and Jane saw tears sparkling in her eyes. Geoffrey paused, uncertain for a moment, then went on. "He threw you into the deep water, and you thought you were going to drown, and you cried out for help, and he just kept shouting, 'Swim, swim,' until finally Grandma ran over and pulled you out." "I don't understand why you're talking about this now," she said, definitely crying now. "I forgave Papa for that long ago. He was just doing what he thought was best for me." "I know that, Mother. But," he waited while she wiped her eyes, "you still don't know how to swim, do you?" "Oh, Geoffrey, I'm so... She looked wildly around the room. "Dexter, I need to go home. Take me home." Dexter was immediately out of his chair, half supporting, half carrying Mrs. Tifton toward the door. Scared and bewildered, Jane tugged on her father's shirt. Geoffrey didn't finish. "Don't let him leave." "But he made a very good beginning. Go to him." Jane rushed over to Geoffrey, now all alone in the middle of the kitchen. "Oh, Geoffrey, you were so fabulously brave." White and stricken, he looked almost as though he didn't recognize her. "Brave?" he said, then flinched as the door slammed shut behind his mother and Dexter. "Son, you'd better go with them," said Mr. Penderwick. "Not yet, Daddy," said Jane. "Yes, Jane, oh, it's best. For now he must keep talking with his mother." Jane tore over to the bottom of the stairs and shouted up at her startled sisters. "Quick, he's leaving." Seconds later, everyone had dashed downstairs and Skye was pressing Geoffrey's backpack into his arms. "Are you all right?" she said. "I don't know." "It's time, Geoffrey," said Mr. Penderwick. "I'm proud of you." "Thank you, sir." He threw the backpack over his shoulder and went out of the door. "Geoffrey, we're going home tomorrow morning," Skye cried after him. "He knows, sweetheart," said Mr. Penderwick. "We've done all we can. It's between him and his mother now." Now there was nothing left but to get ready to leave Arundel. They had to organize and pack and clean, all those melancholy end-of-vacation chores that take so much longer than they should. By the time that was all over, it had started to rain again. Not the kind of strong rain that pounds soothingly on the roof and windows, but an annoying drizzle that made everyone feel damp and restless. No one wanted to go out into it, but inside was too depressing with all the packed boxes waiting by the front door. Finally, Mr. Penderwick, after much Latin that was probably about daughters and mopiness, came up with the idea of farewell gifts for Geoffrey. So Rosalind made her last batch of Arundel brownies, all for Geoffrey, with none set aside for Cagney. Jane bound another copy of Sabrina Starr, Rescues a Boy, and wrote, "To Geoffrey, love from the author" on the title page. After a long internal struggle, Batty decided to give back to Geoffrey the photograph of Hound. But as it was already his, it didn't really count. So she also got out her crayons and drew a picture of the bull. Luckily, she wasn't much of an artist. And Rosalind thought the picture was of Hound and even printed Hound across the top in neat letters. That left only Skye fretting and fuming to come up with a grand gesture. At last she had an inspiration. She emptied one of the packed boxes by transferring Batty's stuffed animals to paper bags, cut it apart, and reconstructed it as a flat piece of cardboard. On this she painted a new Dexter target, larger than the old one, with an even smirkier face. And instead of plain DD across the bottom, DDDD for dreadful, dopey Dexter Dupree. It was a truly impressive target, she thought, and would give Geoffrey an extra special reason to remember her. And all through that oh-so-long and dreary day, what about Geoffrey? The sisters took turns watching out the window for him. But he never came, and he never called. It made them sick with worry not to know what was happening. They couldn't simply knock on Mrs. Tifton's door and ask. Those days were over, and they didn't dare telephone. Finally, that evening, when no one could stand it any more, they voted that Skye sneak over to the rope ladder tree and climb up to see Geoffrey. But as they had feared, the rope ladder was gone, and though there was a light in Geoffrey's window, Skye returned to the cottage, knowing as little as when she had left. "Were you even sure he was up there?" said Jane. "Did you see his shadow, or hear the piano, or anything at all?" "No," said Skye, "nothing." "Dexter could have murdered him and stuffed him in the closet," said Jane. "We'd never know." "If Dexter hurt a hair on Geoffrey's head, I'll murder him." "I'll help," said Batty, boldly waving Funty in the air. "No one's murdering anyone." Rosalind gave Skye and Jane the "now look what you've done" frown. "Sorry," said Jane, twisting and tugging at her curls with frustration. "I just can't stand this waiting." "We're going home first thing tomorrow," said Skye. "What if Geoffrey hasn't come by then?" "He'll come," said Rosalind. "He's got to."